Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. First of all, let me wish you a very happy new year. I hope that 2024 is just filled with blessings, wonderful books, wonderful movies, and wonderful music for you, and just amazing life experiences. So, best wishes. I have a question for you. What is more rare than a poem that inspired a great novel? I would say a poem that inspired two great novels. Waiting for the Barbarians by Konstantinos Pέτρου Cavafys is responsible for two texts that I greatly enjoyed. One of them is The Stronghold, or the Tartar Steppe by Dino Buzzati, and the other one is, of course, Waiting for the Barbarians, the novel by J.M. Coetzee. I did a video on The Stronghold a few weeks ago because I had just read this book for the first time, and I decided it would be a good time to reread Waiting for the Barbarians and to see how the two texts are talking to each other. So that's one of the reasons why I decided to do this video. So let me tell you a little bit first about my experience with Coetzee. As you know, because I have said this many times, a very long time ago I decided that I was going to read at least one book by every winner of the Nobel Prize in literature. Well, that happened in 2003, and guess who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2003? It was, of course, J.M. Coetzee. Let me read you the citation from the Nobel Committee. So the Nobel Prize in Literature for 2003 went to J.M. Coetzee, quote, who in innumerable guises portrays the surprising involvement of the outsider. The outsider is really a concept that we want to keep in mind as we explore Waiting for the Barbarians and other texts by J.M. Coetzee. But anyway, my point here is that I began that project, the Nobel Prize project, basically inspired by J.M. Coetzee. And at that point, I went to a bookstore, and the book that I found there, it's not surprisingly, was Disgrace. Look at this great cover, right? I loved it, okay? I was mesmerized by the prose. I loved how he basically told you an entire story in just a couple of pages. The pace here is just amazing. The narrative economy. So I was like, I really want to check out other books by Coetzee. And the second one that I encountered was Waiting for the Barbarians. So this was an early reading experience in the context of this author and of that Nobel Prize project for me. And then many more came after that. I am showing you here my little Coetzee collection so that you can see more of the books that I have. I really count J.M. Coetzee as one of my favorite authors, and that is also another reason why I was happy to do this video and to revisit one of his novels. So as an introduction to this whole exploration of Waiting for the Barbarians, I think it's a good idea to mention briefly and to look briefly into the poem by Cavafys. As I said before when I did the video on Buzzati, the poem Waiting for the Barbarians is basically about the concept of the enemy and how that concept can sustain an entire society. We are talking here about the concept of a threat, of danger, right? And how fear can be a very powerful factor that has been used repeatedly to control and to condition a group of people. So in the poem you have a group of people there whose lives are basically shaped by this possibility that the barbarians may attack. If you look at the poem, it's actually the last lines of it that are quoted most often, so I wanted to share those with you so that we can use this as a type of an epigraph to our discussion of Waiting for the Barbarians. So towards the end of the poem it says, "Night has fallen and the barbarians haven't come. And some of our men just in from the border say there are no barbarians any longer. Now what's going to happen to us without barbarians? Those people were a kind of solution." Now looking at the plot, I think Waiting for the Barbarians is one of those novels that does not really require much in terms of a plot summary because so many readers have experienced it, fortunately. But let's say a couple of things only just to have, just to refresh, what the story is about. We have at the center the magistrate. He remains unnamed throughout the novel, and he is at an outpost of the empire in a very remote land. So you can already see the connections between the Stronghold or the Tartar Steppe and Waiting for the Barbarians. And this place is threatened supposedly by an attack, an imminent attack from this group of barbarians who live nearby. As the novel begins, the very first thing that happens is that the magistrate receives the visit of a certain Colonel Joel, who is there to interrogate barbarian prisoners and to torture them in order to extract information from them. And what happens is that the magistrate is just horrified by the situation. He is very different from the colonel. He is almost an opposite type of person. He soon develops a physical relationship with one of the barbarian young women, a girl who has been tortured and who cannot see very well. She sees a blur in front of her eyes, but she can see like at an angle. So that is a result of the tortures that she has suffered. And because of this connection and because of something he does, he basically ends up being in opposition to Colonel Joel and basically an enemy of the empire that he represented. The structure of the novel is really effective and really nice. The story is divided into 6 parts or 6 chapters. And this is a very brief text, okay? This is only 156 pages long exactly, but it has a lot of depth to it. So I thought that as a way to approach this novel, that we might look at the parts separately, very briefly, and just comment on a couple of important things to kind of have an overview of the text, because it's really, really good in its structure. And I think this is one of the best novels that I have read also in that aspect, the aspect of the scaffolding, if you will, of the text. So the first part really plunges us into a world of torture and degradation. It really doesn't take long for the reader to realize that this is not going to be a light read. Okay, we are in a very, very dark place. And the first detail that we hear about is that the colonel wears sunglasses. This is something that troubles the magistrate, who is our narrator. And what it does, right, this idea that he wears sunglasses, is that it takes away from his humanity. If you think about it, there's that old saying that says that the eyes are the windows of the soul. That's one thing that I thought about when I read that. So if he's wearing these dark glasses, you cannot really see into him. It makes him impenetrable to the other's gaze. I think that is part of the reason why we wear sunglasses in the first place. The protection from the rays of the sun and all that kind of stuff is only part of it, right? So another part has to do with protecting ourselves and not letting other people read us very easily. The magistrate is really a very interesting character. He is quite humane, especially when you compare him to Colonel Joel, who is presented as a brutal figure. So I like the way that he describes himself to us. You can find this on page 8 at the very beginning of the novel. The magistrate says, "I did not mean to get embroiled in this. I am a country magistrate, a responsible official in the service of the empire, serving out my days on this lazy frontier, waiting to retire." And there's a little bit more after that, and then he says, "When I pass away, I hope to merit 3 lines of small print in the Imperial Gazette. I have not asked for more than a quiet life in quiet times." So we have a very brief portrait of the magistrate by himself. After that, we move on to part number 2, and this is where the magistrate meets the barbarian girl and develops a physical relationship with her. He is really curious about what she has endured, the experience of the interrogation and the tortures that she has been subjected to. And of course, as you can imagine, she is reluctant to speak, at least at first. Then little by little she begins to share some details of what happened to her. But the magistrate is not only curious about her, there's another thing that is happening also within him. He's experiencing a sort of crisis as he connects with the barbarian girl, because he realizes that he's getting older. He's already an older person when compared to the barbarian young woman, but he's getting older. He is troubled by his sexuality, for example. So that's his inner conflict. And I would say that if you look at the second part, I think the main theme right here is desire and the connection that exists between desire and power, right? There's a point at which the magistrate wonders if what he is doing with the barbarian girl is any different from what the torturers did to her. There's a passage here that I also want to share with you that is very important when it comes to this topic right here. And this is something that he asks himself. Is this how her torturers felt hunting their secret, whatever they thought it was? For the first time I feel a dry pity for them. How natural a mistake to believe that you can burn or tear or hack your way into the secret body of the other. This is on page 43, by the way. After that we have part 3, and this is when the magistrate decides to go to the barbarian land with a couple of companions and also with the girl, because what he wants to do is he wants to take the girl back to her people. This part, because of that, is marked by a sense of quest. okay? And those who travel in this journey, they encounter a lot of hardship. They experience illness. They experience a very strong and very powerful storm also. But at the same time, the magistrate begins to connect at a deeper level with the barbarian girl as he begins to see a lot more of her outside of the bedroom, if we could put it that way. So he comes to understand her better. And I think most importantly here is he starts to think not only about himself, but also about her culture, about her situation. So I think in this third part, what happens to me most importantly is that the magistrate develops a deeper sense of empathy. Then we come to part 4, okay? He is back at the outpost. He has come back after the journey into the barbarian land, and basically because of this trip that he made, he has been considered now an enemy of the state, and he is put into prison. I thought when I was reading this, because we have this idea of the individual against the state, right, against the empire in this case, of something like the situation that we find in George Orwell's 1984. You also have there this concept of the individual out of a sense of principle, maybe, though I do want to say that the magistrate does not regard himself as a hero. That is very important to keep in mind and to emphasize also. But that is something that you see there in both of these novels and in many other texts. So this chapter, chapter 4, is the longest by far in the novel, and it's also the most introspective. That makes perfect sense if you ask me, because we are dealing with a man who has been imprisoned, right? A man who has plenty of time to think about himself and to look at his experience, his personality and all that he has been through. So after that, we have the last 2 parts that I want to put together because they are very brief, especially the last part of the novel, but parts 5 and 6. And in these parts, if you had to look for a subtitle here, it would probably be Things Fall Apart, okay? Things get complicated for the empire. The attack seems to be about to happen at any moment, but the place is just collapsing. It's chaos, people are leaving. And because of that, the magistrate gets a lot more freedom, because the authorities are much more preoccupied with other things. They have more important things to do than to look after him. I think it is in part number 5 that you find what is, to me, right, the most important passage in the novel. But I want to share with you that passage when we talk about what is also, to me, the most important theme of Waiting for the Barbarians. And after that, of course, we get to the last part, part number 6, which has an air of the epilogue to it. You know what I mean? It's very brief, it's very subtle, and the frontier is now deserted. The people have left. The magistrate is left there to look at what has been left after the empire has passed through this place, through these figures of authority, like, for example, Colonel Joel. And there's still a sense of expectation, and that's what I like about the novel, that we get one of those wonderful open endings, very appropriately open in this case. So I told you I would like to explore the main theme of the novel. This may be a little bit obvious, but we still need to talk about it. I believe the main theme of Waiting for the Barbarians is the concept of power. This is a novel that really understands the dynamics of power in all their complexity. We tend to think of power in terms of binary concepts. We have on the one hand the oppressor, and on the other hand the oppressed, right? The oppressor has power, the oppressed does not have power. That is not really the way it is at all. It is much more complex than that, because I think power is not really something that you can have. Power is something that you exercise, or that different people exercise in various degrees depending on the circumstances. I think there is a way in which you could say that the oppressed exercises power over the oppressor, because I see power as a kind of a web in which everybody is trapped, the oppressor, the oppressed, and everybody. And I think this novel really illustrates that very well. So the passage of the novel that was the most important to me, and which has to do precisely with this issue, you can find on page 133. And this is what it says. What has made it impossible for us to live in time like fish in water, like birds in air, like children? It is the fault of empire. Empire has created the time of history. Empire has located its existence not in the smooth recurrent spinning time of the cycle of the seasons, but in the jagged time of rise and fall, of beginning and end, of catastrophe. Empire dooms itself to live in history and plot against history. One thought alone preoccupies the submerged mind of empire. How not to end, how not to die, how to prolong its era. So once again, I think that really illustrates what I was telling you about before, this idea that power is much more complex, that it is not only the oppressed who are caught in it, but the oppressor, in this case the empire, as well. That to me is a more accurate view of the whole complexity of power, and I think that this novel really illustrates it very well. So one thing that I was thinking about was, remember back in the day when we watched He-Man, and he said, by the power of Grayskull, I have the power. Well, I'm sorry to say this, it really breaks my heart, and I don't want to ruin your childhood or anything, but He-Man was just lying to us, okay? Because power is not something that you have. Power is something, once again, that different people exercise in various degrees depending on the circumstances. But that is really, really very sad for me to think about, that He-Man was wrong, So let's just move on to another part of this video. The next part that I want to talk about is something almost mandatory, and that is the comparison with The Stronghold by Dino Buzzati. I think this is something that is expected because both novels were inspired by the same poem, and Waiting for the Barbarians was inspired by The Stronghold. So this is something that we really need to look at. So how do these novels talk to each other? I'm just going to say a couple of things about this. The first one is that I believe that Waiting for the Barbarians has a much less important allegorical dimension to it. I believe Waiting for the Barbarians is more literal, if we're going for that dichotomy, which I think is simplistic, but at this moment it works. Literal versus allegorical. I think Waiting for the Barbarians is more literal, more immediate. That doesn't mean that there is no allegorical dimension to Waiting for the Barbarians, because I believe that there's an allegorical possibility of reading to almost any text. So, let's keep that in mind also. But another important difference that you are going to find is the presence and the importance of women in these two books. For example, if you look at The Stronghold, women are not very present in this novel. All that we get in terms of that has to do with Drogo's mother and with Maria, the girl that he knows. But if you look at Waiting for the Barbarians, of course, you have a lot more when it comes to the depiction and the portrayal of women here, because of the relationship between the magistrate and the barbarian girl. So you see a lot more of the dynamics of female and male and all that. This one, The Stronghold, is basically one of those, I hate to call it this, but it's one of those novels for guys, right? Almost like Moby Dick, like Lord of the Flies. It's that kind of thing. But there's another connection, okay? Obviously, these novels are talking to each other, but I wanted to connect them also to an Argentine novel that I have mentioned before, and that I did a video on, and that is Zama by Antonio Di Benedetto. I also mentioned it when I talked about The Lost Steppes by Alejo Carpentier. So there are many, many connections here. But back when I did that video on Zama, I told you that J.M. Coetzee actually wrote a review of Zama. So you can already see that this author is interested in this other text by this great Argentine author. Di Benedetto's novel is also about an official who is living in a remote land. He is representing a structure of power, if you will. It is also a novel about waiting, and many people actually say that Zama is part of a waiting trilogy that Di Benedetto wrote. And finally, another connection that you can find between these two is that both of them can be described as existentialist novels. That's one word that you can use to describe them. So I strongly recommend that you read Zama. There's my video on it if you want to hear more about it. But I also recommend that you read the review by J.M. Coetzee, because that gives you a lot of insight into the work of Coetzee himself. I wanted to add also a word about the movie adaptation. Okay, Waiting for the Barbarians was adapted into film in 2019 by the Colombian director Ciro Guerra. So he was the director, but the screenplay was written by J.M. Coetzee himself. And just to put a little bit of context here, Ciro Guerra was the filmmaker who gave us Embrace of the Serpent, an excellent film, okay, highly recommended. Now, when I was looking at Waiting for the Barbarians, I was really struck when I looked it up online at how low the rating was on IMDb. It was 5.9. So to be honest with you, I almost did not watch the movie. I was like, do I really want to watch this movie? Then I found myself with a couple of extra hours in my life, and I was like, what the heck? Let's watch it. I have just reread the novel, so that works for me. And I want to say this. I just don't understand why the rating is so low, okay? The acting is really good. We have Mark Rylance as the magistrate. Then, of course, we have Johnny Depp as Colonel Joel and Robert Pattinson as Mandel, the guy who's looking after the magistrate when he's imprisoned. And then, of course, we have Gana Bayarsaikan as the girl, as she is called in the movie, right? Because she does not have a name, just like the magistrate does not really have a name. So the acting, I thought it was wonderful. The photography, I really liked also. The music, I don't know, everything just seemed wonderful about it. I was like, maybe the pace is something that people did not like because it's a little bit slow, it's contemplative, but then so is the novel. So it's not something that you can, find as a fault of the movie. This is a rather slow-paced novel, even though it is only 156 pages long. I would say it is contemplative. That's one way that I could describe it. As you know, Coetzee has different types of style depending on the topic. If you look at something like Disgrace, the pace here is quite fast, so that's one of the reasons why I liked it so much. And then on the other hand, you can look at something like Foe. I'm looking for the novel here it is. Something like Foe is much more contemplative, once again. So I would say that Waiting for the Barbarians is right between these two in terms of the pace. So that's one thing that I thought about. Maybe that's one of the reasons why the movie was not received in a better way. There was one thing that I thought about as I was watching this movie. The very last shot. Okay, I'm not going to ruin anything for you, but if you decide to watch the movie, the very last image that we see, I thought that it should have been a little bit more ambiguous. Maybe that's just me. I can totally see why they decided to do it the way they did, but to me it should have been, if in keeping with the novel, right, a little bit more ambiguous. But that's just my opinion on that final shot. I really do recommend the movie, and let me take this opportunity also once again to recommend Embrace of the Serpent, a movie that was nominated for an Academy Award, and it's just one of the best Latin American films that I have ever seen. Bottom line, Waiting for the Barbarians is one of J.M. Coetzee's most important novels, and it is also one of his most excellent novels. It is not my favorite. I do want to say that. More to come about this because I do want to keep exploring the work of J.M. Coetzee, but the themes that you find in Waiting for the Barbarians, we could say, unfortunately, make it a timeless work, okay? Because we have this theme of oppression, and I wish we could say that this is something that will go away soon. We all have that hope. I don't think it's a necessary aspect of the human condition, oppression, right? But unfortunately, it's something that has been there. So that's why I say, unfortunately, a timeless work in that sense. But also, beyond the theme, the style of this novel is just wonderful, and it illustrates at least one of the veins in which J.M. Coetzee writes, that more contemplative vein. And I think that's another thing that makes Waiting for the Barbarians a great text. I can tell you that after rereading this text, I really feel like reconnecting with Coetzee. It had been a very, very long time since the last time that I had read him. And I have at least two novels. I think I have two novels here that I have not read. The Master of Petersburg and Diary of a Bad Year. So I may explore one of those soon because I really want to read Coetzee again. He is an author that really inspires me as a reader, but he also inspires me greatly as a writer. He's like a muse to me. When I read Coetzee, I feel like stopping all of my reading projects, putting everything aside, and just starting to write once again. So that's something that I always enjoy and that I always appreciate. So do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Those were my 2 cents on Waiting for the Barbarians by J.M. Coetzee. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.